a few years ago, right as we were getting started to launch the church, we had like this really busy week, and the church was launching in a couple weeks, and Megan was in the middle of going back to school. Like we had no time for anything, and we realized it's like a Sunday night or something, and we need stuff for the next day. We need some groceries, we need paper towels, things like that, right? And it was just as Amazon Fresh, the grocery delivery service from Amazon, was just starting up, and we had gotten some sort of like early access thing that we could use it. And we're about to go to bed at midnight, and Megan places an order. And the next morning we wake up and it's 5 a.m. and everything that we needed was right outside our door. And that sounds like if you had told us, a few years ago that could happen, you would be saying now that's just the norm, right? Like we have access to everything so fast in our phones. We have access to all of the information that we can think about. We can press a button and a car shows up out of nowhere to pick us up and take us wherever. Like a few years ago, you had to call a cab company and you had to wait for like 45 minutes, and they may show up, may not show up. It was incredibly expensive. Like there's certain things in life that the friction between us and time has completely gone away, right? And in a way, we're kind of like used to not having to wait for things that generations before us were used to having to wait. And one side, that's great. I think that's awesome, right? On the other side, though, I do wonder if there's an effect to that, right? Like we live in this world of truly instant gratification that maybe in a way is kind of like making us used to not having to wait. With a lot of us, we're uncomfortable when we have to wait. If you ever have to, I don't know, like do something where you don't have access to your phone and you can't look at it while you're like, sitting around, you go crazy because you don't want to just be bored. And the reason why I'm sharing that with you is because today we're talking about a fruit of the Spirit. It's a fruit of patience. And I think that there's a way in which how the world has developed, how technology has advanced in such a way that nothing in our lives requires us to wait, that affects our capacity to be patient. And the problem with that, of course, is that most of the things that are important in life, most of the things that matter in life, are things that we need patience for, things that demand patience of us. If you want to start a good relationship, you need patience. It takes time. If you want to master a craft or a skill, that is something that won't happen from one day to the next, something that takes time to do. If you want to mature emotionally or spiritually, dealing with understanding your own personal issues or learning to seek God and develop the spiritual disciplines of growing closer to God, those are things that take time. We live in a world that's designed to make us not be patient. And at the same time, a world that if we want to thrive, if we want to live a healthy, good life, we need patience. What can we possibly do? Now, the good news is that, as we've been journeying through these different fruit of the Spirit, these 9 characteristics that the Apostle Paul talks to us about in the book of Galatians, what we see is that these are things that we don't have to manufacture ourselves, that we cannot make us become more loving people or more joyful people or more peaceful people, or as we're going to see today, more patient people. That these are things that the Holy Spirit working in our lives wants to produce. And what I want to do today is take you to a passage in the scriptures that I think gives us this map, this picture, this image of what a life of patience looks like. And this is a passage in the book of James. James is the half brother of Jesus. And once Jesus ascends to heaven, James actually becomes one of the pillars of the early Christian community. He's depicted in the book of Acts as the leader of the church in Jerusalem. And the letter of James is kind of like versus this collection of all of his teachings. And he has like different topics that he's looking at. But one of the main themes that you see in there is how a lot of times in the midst of suffering, God can use suffering to shape our character and to make us look more like Jesus, which is what we're talking about in the fruit of the Spirit. And in this context, he gets to a section where he's actually teaching about patience and the connection between patience and how our character grows. That's what I want to show you today. This is James chapter 5, and I'm also reading on verse 7. It says, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and the late rains. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. As an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful." This is the word of the Lord. And James touches on a lot of things. And he starts saying, "Be patient, therefore, brothers, until the coming of the Lord." And at the time of the early church, one of the beliefs that they had is that they thought that that Jesus was returning in their lifetimes, and a lot of what the teachings that you see are kind of like in that context of these people that were expecting Jesus to come back, and part of the problem that happens is that as the years are going back and Jesus doesn't come back, there's all this doubt about, well, is Jesus coming back? Was he lying to us? Was he making this up? Is he being slow for some reason? And it's in that context that James is telling the early church, be patient and keep waiting for the Lord. And the interesting thing is that he starts there talking about this patience of waiting for the return of the Lord, and uses kind of like that as a window into talking about other forms of patience, or in other words, how our patience for the Lord kind of like plays out in the rest of elements of our life. So he uses this metaphor about a farmer waiting for the precious fruit of the earth, and he's basically saying like a farmer has no control over how fast a seed grows. He says to wait for it, which is interesting because we're talking about this idea of the fruit of the Spirit, right? There's this connection that we don't manufacture the fruit, that we don't control how long it takes. A part of, the patience is part of how we see and let the Holy Spirit work in our lives as the fruit of the Spirit comes about. And then he says, just as a farmer is patient, he says, you also be patient. And then he says this, establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. And part of what he's saying is this. He's saying, like, listen, as you're waiting for the age to come, or as you're waiting for the return of Jesus, you're waiting for the new world that Jesus is bringing about, that waiting for the new world, that patience that you're having for the thing that God is doing in the world, that is a thing where your heart is lodged on. That's the thing that your eyes are fixed on, the fact that God is going to end suffering, that God is going to transform the world. There's a day coming where God is going to change everything and make all things new. And that's where you ultimately place your patience on. And he's saying, and because you're being patient about that, then that has all these sorts of implications. So he keeps going to verse 9. He says, do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. It's interesting that the first element that he talks about patience is in the context of interpersonal relationships. The word for patience that you read in the Bible has like a number of different meanings, because a couple of different words actually that are Greek words that we read as patience in English. But one of those words, the meaning of that word is, and the word that's used in this particular passage is the word long suffering. And it sounds like an interesting word to talk about patience, but the idea of that is kind of like a person that's able to, endure a lot before reaching the breaking point. And you probably meet people like that, right? Like people that are very patient with others when others are not doing the thing that they want them to do, when other people are being frustrated. And sometimes we see people in situations like, I would have blown my fuse a long time ago. And you're so patient. Like that idea is the word long suffering. And actually, when you look at the Bible, the origin of that phrase is in the Old Testament, where God is described as being slow to anger. And he's using that metaphor and saying, be long suffering. And the first thing he says, like, don't grumble against one another. He takes patience to bear in interpersonal relationships. And it's interesting that the connection that he makes is, do not grumble against one another, so that you may not be judged. As behold, the judge is standing at the door. What does it make this connection between patience and judgment? And I have a clue, I think, of what it is. There's this parable in the Gospel of Matthew that I've preached before. It's called the parable of the unforgiving servant. And because of time, I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but the idea is that there is this king that decides one day to kind of like call in all of his debt. Like all the people that owe him money, he was going to call in all of those loans and start, pay up. And one of the servants owed him 10,000 talents. At that time, a talent was 20 years' wages. So 10,000 talents is a ton of money. Like I did some research, like what Bible scholars thought it would be today, and I found anything from $7 billion to $1 trillion. Okay, the point of the parable is that nobody could come up with that money unless you're like Jeff Bezos. Like nobody has enough money to come up with that much money on the spot. And so the king calls the servant and asks him for the money. And the servant tells the king this. The servant says to the king, "Have patience with me and I will pay everything." Forcing this and asks for patience. The king is moved to compassion and forgives the debt of the servant. The servant walks out of the chamber of meeting with the king and he runs into a friend of his who owes him money. And this guy owes him 100 silver coins. For comparison, 100 silver coins or 100 denarii is about 3 to 4 months of wages. Do you see the difference in amounts? This guy owes $1 trillion and somebody owes him 3 to 4 months of wages. And in the story, the guy jumps at his friend and starts choking him, demanding that he pay up. The king finds out, and the king throws the first servant that he had forgiven the debt into jail for not being able to have patience with his friend, because his friend, when he shows up, he also doesn't ask for forgiveness, he asks for patience. And there's a bunch of stuff in the story, but one of the interesting, themes of the story is that, the servants, they don't ask for forgiveness or the debt, they ask for patience. The problem is that they ask for patience at least the first servant asks for patience to pay a debt that he cannot possibly pay. He's asking really for, infinite patience from the king. And in the story, obviously, the king represents God and we represent the first servant. And part of what Jesus is saying in the story that's connected to this is, why was that servant judged? That servant was judged because when he asked for patience, God didn't only give him patience, he gave him forgiveness. The king doesn't say, "Hey, I will be patient with you." No, I forgive your debt. And he goes out of that room and he's not able to give patience to the people around him. And many of us, even though we have been forgiven the unforgivable, even though we've received the eternal grace and mercy from God, we're not able to be patient with the people around us. And part of the reason why is because we think that patience has to generate within us. So if we are patient with somebody, we think that we're great. It's a guy, I'm so good at patient with people, right? Or we flip at people and we have a very short fuse and we think, well, I just don't have enough patience. And what's interesting about this story, what's interesting about the passage that we just read in the book of James, and the idea that patience is a fruit of the Spirit, is that this type of patience doesn't originate with us. Like what Jesus is saying and what James is saying is like, listen, your patience doesn't come from how good of a person you are. It doesn't even come from how deserving or undeserving the person that you should be patient with is, right? Some people are really frustrating and they get on our nerves and it's so hard for us to have patience with them. Some people are very easy to have patience with them because they never bother us. So like every once in a while, we're totally cool being patient with them. And these passages throw the idea out the window. It says, no, you have to be patient not because of how they are or how you are, but because you have been shown something even better than patience. You've been forgiven. When you ask for patience, God took your debt, crumpled up and threw it away and said it's paid for. How can people that have received that not show then patience to others? So that's kind of like the first dimension of patience that we see in this passage. Then he keeps going on in the story, in the passage. He says, Verse 10, he says, as an example of suffering and patience, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. Behold, we consider those blessed who remain steadfast. You have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord, how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. James goes on from talking about patience with others, and then he kind of like switches gears and he starts talking about this idea of suffering and patience. And he uses an example, two figures, right? He uses the prophets of old, the prophets of the Old Testament, and he uses Job. And what's going on here is that, as I told you earlier, patience in the Bible has different meanings. One of those meanings is the idea of being long-suffering. But another of the meanings for patience is more about around the idea of endurance, or the idea of steadfastness. The image in the original Hebrew is somebody that's able to stand under pressure. That when a difficult situation is on them, they don't just crack. And in this passage, he's saying, it's like, listen, as you're waiting for the Lord, the patience that we have waiting for the thing that God is doing in the world plays itself out in, or everyday life in two ways. One is our patience with others, and then he's saying, and the other is our patience in the times of difficulty, in the times of trouble. And he uses the example, first of all, of the prophets of old. The prophets of old were not always popular. A lot of the prophets in the Old Testament, they're generally calling Israel to repentance, or they're announcing some judgment from God for something that the Israelites have done. A lot of times they're doing that in front of the kings, and the kings don't like hearing that. So they're throwing these prophets in jail. And a lot of times these prophets are mocked and ridiculed because, the prophecy that they've proclaimed hasn't come about yet. So many of those prophets just lived lives of difficulty, of suffering. And he's saying, look how they endured. And then he brings up the story of Job. And we've shared the story of Job before. Job is this character in the Old Testament who suffers tremendous loss and tragedy very, very suddenly. And the whole book of Job is basically this kind of like, analysis of suffering, this questioning into the concept, why do people suffer, right? And the whole book is this, conversation that Job has with his friends that are saying, maybe you're suffering because you sin, maybe you were exploiting the poor, and that's why God is punishing you. And throughout the book, one of the things that we see is that Job is very confused. Job is afflicted. Job is suffering. The one thing that Job never does is he never gives up hope that God is going to show up on the other side. He doesn't understand why it's happening. He doesn't know why God has allowed what's happened, but he is steadfast in the idea that God is going to show up. And God is going to show up, and God is going to talk to him and be with him in the midst of this, and maybe even end his suffering. And that's how the story goes. Eventually God shows up. God never actually gives Job an explanation for his suffering. Instead, God kind of like paints this picture for Job about how he is the one who upholds creation, who's created everything and rules the universe. And then God restores the life of Job and restores the things that Job has lost. And it's interesting that these are the two images that James uses, because there's a difference between the two images, right? Like a lot of the prophets die without seeing the thing that they have prophesied come about. Job suffers and never gets an answer, an explanation for his suffering, but he sees the hand of God restore his life. And I think that's intentional. I think that the part of what James is saying, listen, patience in suffering can take a couple of different ways. Maybe the answer that you're seeking for will come. And maybe the difficult time that you're going through will end. Maybe it won't. And there's people on both of those ends of the spectrum throughout the Bible that were able to remain steadfast. They're able to endure. They're able to withstand the tremendous pressure, the tremendous suffering, and they didn't crack. And there's actually a reason for that. How does that passage say, that you have heard of the steadfastness of Job, and you have seen the purpose of the Lord. And then listen to it. How the Lord is compassionate and merciful. That last line, compassionate and merciful, James is actually echoing back to the most famous passage in the Hebrew Bible, which is Exodus chapter 34, starting on verse 6. And this is the story of an encounter that Moses has with God, where Moses asked God, show me your glory, show me who you are. And God said, you cannot see my glory, you would die. But I'm going to pass it behind you, and I'm going to speak my name to you. And what happens in the passage is that God appears and God describes himself to Moses. And this is how God opens that description. Exodus 34, verse 6 says, the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious. It's the same line that we see used in the James passage, like a different translation, but it's that same original line. And then is what the passage in Exodus says: slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. You know what's happening in that passage? James kind of like just tagging that line on, like this is basically, you should be patient, and this is what patience looks like. And then he says, and look how the Lord is compassionate and merciful. He's trying to connect them to that passage in Exodus, and immediately their mind will, oh yeah, the Lord was compassionate and gracious, and then was slow to anger. Slow to anger is the original definition of patience in the Hebrew Bible. What he's saying is he's painting them this picture of patience, and he's saying, you know who's patient? God. You know why you should be patient? Because God was patient with you. Because everything that's kind of like taking place and happening in the world is the patience of God. That the reason why we're still alive, why we're breathing, is because God's being patient with us. The reason why Jesus came at the time that he came is because God, in his patience, waited for just the right time to send his son. The reason why now we wait for the day of the Lord, right? Is because God is being patient with the world, trying to bring everybody to salvation, as 2 Peter says. And it's in that context that we're invited to patience. I think that part of what James is saying is, listen, patience is not something that's going to come from you. Patience is something that's going to come from God. And you have to look to God, to this God who is slow to anger. And then what does the passage in Exodus say? Slow to anger says, and abounding in what? In steadfast love and faithfulness. Steadfastness is one of the words in the Hebrew Bible for patience. It's almost like you're saying God is slow to anger, and he's abounding in patient love, in love that doesn't crack. What he's saying is a bunch of different things, right? Like that how God loves us through his patience. But I also think he's saying that the source of God's patience, the reason why God is slow to anger, is because he's abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. That God's patience originates in his love. That when we step into the love of God, his patience comes into our heart. And the invitation for us is, well, what are the areas in my life where God's patience wants to come to bear? Maybe it's a person, maybe it's a family member, a friend, somebody at work that we just can't bear and can't tolerate, that they're in our last nerve. And God says, listen, you can be patient with them, right? Let my patience overflow into your heart. The patience of the God who's slow to anger, who's abounding in steadfast love. That's the patience that you need. For some of us, we are enduring suffering. And we're in the midst of very difficult trials. And it feels like we've been waiting for a long time. And it feels like we've been waiting in vain. I'll be honest, that I felt so many times like that. Like I've been waiting in vain. I think it's so interesting that in this passage, the invitation is to wait, not just for what's happening, but for the day of the Lord. That's an invitation that perhaps maybe why it's so hard to wait is because we're waiting for the wrong thing. They were waiting for this problem to solve itself, and it's not like the problem can't solve itself, but it's we're invited to place our sight in a different goal, in a different hope. And the hope is how the passage begins, right? Be patient, therefore, until the coming of the Lord. That we're called to be patient, not only for this job situation, not only for this relationship situation, not only for this health situation, that we're called to be patient for the day when all of these things are wrapped up in God and healed and put back together. When all the brokenness of the world is fixed through Jesus Christ. So that's the thing that we're ultimately invited to be patient for. And when we're patient for that, when our eyes are on that, what we're doing is that we're waiting on the Lord, that we're ultimately waiting that the Lord will step into history and heal and restore. Sometimes that will take place on this side of eternity. Sometimes God will step into history and heal that relationship and heal that thing that is not working and show up at the right moment. But the larger vision, the most important vision, is that even if that doesn't happen, that we believe because of the promise that Jesus Christ has made to us, who defeated death, that there's a day when all of the things that we're waiting for will come to happen. And that's what patience looks like. I wanna close with this, right? It's a passage in the book of Isaiah. It says, "But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." So the ultimate thing we're waiting for is the Lord. And when we wait on the Lord, no one waits on anything else, but when we wait on the Lord, our strength is renewed. That a lot of times we think that our strength, our hope will be renewed when the thing that we're waiting for will come to happen. And part of what this passage is saying, no, you can get that now. As you wait. That's how you wait. That as you wait, or when you wait on the Lord, your strength is renewed, your hope is renewed. I don't know what you're waiting for. What I need to know is that whatever you're waiting for, the thing that we're all invited to ultimately wait for is for God. For God to come, for God to move, for God to show up in our lives, for God to show up in history. And when we wait on that, our strength is renewed. So may you today develop patience, not human patience, but the patience that's a fruit of the Spirit. And may you learn to wait on the Lord. And may He renew your strength, grace, and peace.